If you want to learn Spring, if you really want to master the Spring framework, the first place you got to start is with just putting together a simple Spring framework Hello World application. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're not going to confuse things by talking about dependency injection or inversion of control or coding to interfaces, none of that. We can get into all of that later, and that's all really cool stuff. But right now, I just want to get a simple application working that uses the Spring framework. Now, I will say, in this tutorial, I'm just going to look at the core Spring framework. I'm not even going to use Spring Boot. I've got some tutorials on how to use Spring Boot and do Hello World in Spring Boot as well. But even if it's Spring Boot you're interested in, you really should start just with the core Spring framework if you really want to learn how Spring works. Hi, I'm Cameron McKenzie. I'm the editor-in-chief over at theserverside.com, and I have to be one of the world's biggest Spring advocates. And I get a lot of people just asking me, how do you get started with a Spring? And how can I really learn the fundamentals of Spring? Well, you start by writing your first Spring Hello World program, and that is exactly what we're going to do next. Okay, kicking this off, I should probably mention the prerequisites for this Spring Hello World tutorial. The only thing you need to have installed is an IDE that supports Java and has a build tool like Maven or Gradle. Now, on my operating system, I don't have any of those things actually installed. All I installed was the Spring Source tool suite for Eclipse, and everything is packaged inside of it, including Maven, your Java runtime environment, and of course a great IDE. Now, a lot of people complain this is a boomer IDE, so if you want to configure VSCode or use that IntelliJ, go right ahead. But as long as you can create a basic Maven project, you're good. And that's exactly what I'm going to do to kick things off. I'm going to click on this link that says create a new Maven project. In Eclipse, I'm going to select to create a simple project because this allows me to just basically start a Maven project from start that's got nothing else configured in it. I got to configure the gav, so I'll call it com.mcnz.spring.helloworld. Why not? That'll be the group ID. I got to specify the artifact ID, and then the version, I'll just accept that default. It's called the GAV, by the way, GAV, artifact, group ID, and version, the GAV, the GAV. That sets things up. I'm going to click finish right there, and I end up getting a handsome little Java program. And if I double click on this, you'll notice that in that Maven project, do you see that red X there? If you see the red X there, you need to get your eyes checked because that's a white X inside of a red circle. But if you do see that white X there, don't worry, that's just Maven saying hello to you. I think that error goes away if you put an S on that HTTPS there, but if you don't, it's not going to cause big problems later. But what will cause a big problem is if you don't link to the actual Spring APIs. And that's the first thing I've got to do. Over on Maven Central, I've looked up the link to the Spring context. This is what I'm going to bring into my project here. I'm going to copy that. By the way, if you're using Gradle, there's the coordinates for Gradle right there. But if I copy this in, this is going to give me access to the core Spring libraries and the ability to create a Spring context. And a context is really what we think of when we think of as a Spring container where we can get beans out of. So I'm going to add that over here to this project. I'm going to have to enter in dependencies. Oh, and I copied the Gradle, I think. I need the Maven. Okay, that's copied now. I'll throw that in for my dependencies. Maybe even tab that in just a little bit to make it look a little bit nicer. And boom, all of a sudden we've got access to the core Spring framework and the context classes that allow me to create an application context, which is really the name that we give to the Spring container where we get our Java beans from. Now, whenever I do that, I always like to just right click on my project. It might not even be necessary, but I like to do a quick Maven install. And the Maven install, just make sure that all the libraries that I've referenced there are pulled down from Maven Central, and I don't run into any major problems here. So see a little bit of output in that console window there, and it looks like everything's good. Now, by the way, one thing I would recommend you do is head over to that Maven link and look at the different libraries that get added by adding that dependency to the Spring context. By adding that dependency, you get access to Spring JCL and Spring Core. Spring JCL and Spring Core are what you get if you import in, if you reference just the core Spring libraries through Maven. If you reference Spring context, you get those, plus you get micrometer, commons, observation, AOP, aspect-oriented program. It's an important part of Spring. You get beans, context. That's going to represent our container, and some help with expression languages. So there you go. Now, a lot of people say, when you work with Spring, when you use nothing but Spring and you don't use Spring Boot or you don't use some other Spring, then, Spring gives you support for JDBC and transactions and all these other things. And you can see right there that if you just reference the Spring context, you don't get any of that stuff. You don't get JDBC support. You don't get database support. You don't get REST support. If you're just working with a core Spring framework, well, in this case, if you reference Spring context, you're just getting the Spring IoC, inversion of control container, which we're going to take a look at in just a second. Okay, now I should probably mention just how this application's going to work. One of the challenges with working with Spring is you always have to work with multiple components. First of all, we're going to have the Spring container. We're going to create an instance of a Spring container, and we're going to tell that Spring container to keep track of one of the Java beans that we create. We're going to create a class called greetings. That class called greetings is going to have a method called say hello world. And when we want to print out hello world, what we'll do is we'll ask the Spring container, hey, give me that Spring bean, that Java bean you're managing. It'll give it to us, and then we'll call on some of its methods. Super simple, super straightforward. But, we do have a couple of components that we have to have interacting here. So I'm going to go over to this folder where I can create a brand new class. I'm going to create a new class. It looks like that's a good package. I'm going to call this class the Spring Hello World Program class. I'm going to add in a main method because we want to be able to run this. There's going to be a simple class with a main method. Now, in that main method, we're going to instantiate the Spring container, the application context as they call it, and we're going to tell it to track a Java bean that we're going to create. But in order for it to track that Java bean, we actually got to create that Java bean, which is why I'm going to create this class here. I'm going to say class greetings, and this class greetings will have one method. It'll be public, it will be void, and it will be called say hello world. A simple method. And then you know the drill, system.out.println hello world. Okay, so there we go. We've got our Java bean, and what we want to do is we want Spring to manage that bean. Now, in a Hello World tutorial, we're not supposed to get in depth on all of these advanced concepts. We just want to get things working. But I just want to give you a brief description of how Spring works. The idea is there's a thing called a Spring container or a Spring context. And if you've got Java beans that have complicated life cycles or Java beans that have massive configuration to them, well, rather than putting that in your business logic and doing all the configuration and lifecycle management in your configuration logic, you're just supposed to pass that work off to the Spring container. Tell the Spring container you do all of that stuff for me. And in my logic, I'm just going to concentrate on doing that core business logic. That's the way it's supposed to work. Now, how do we create this Spring container? Well, I'm going to declare an instance of the application context. And I'm going to call that Spring. Application context is the technical name we give to that good old Spring container. So that's the Spring container there. I'll call it Spring. In enterprise code, you'll usually see it referenced as just context. And here's how I initialize it. Application context is just an interface. We have to create a concrete class, and this gets a little bit ridiculous here. I'm gonna need some extra space, and it is annotation config application context. So this is a special type of Spring context, Spring container that is good at processing annotations. It's just a lot of code, right? Everyone always slags Java and Spring for being so verbose, and it's tough on the very first tutorial, hello world, getting this giant class name, but it is what it is, right? We will let the Python people laugh at us for that, and we'll laugh at them for not being able to thread across cores. Anyways, here we go. What we're doing here is we're saying, I want to create an instance of the Spring container. I want to initialize the Spring container. I want to initialize the Spring framework. And I want the Spring framework to manage this greetings class for me. Okay, so all I've done here is I've just initialized the Spring container, and I've said, please manage the lifecycle of the greeting class. Now, by having Spring manage the lifecycle of the greeting class, that means that I don't have to call the constructor to create an instance of it, right? Normally, I would say greetings equals new greetings or something like that. But if somebody else is managing the bean, you don't call the constructor. You let the container call the constructor. You let the container create instances and manage instances for you. That's one of the reasons why they call it inversion of control. It's a confusing term, I think. But basically what you're saying is normally I would call a constructor to create a greeting object, but I'm going to let the container do it. Instead of doing it myself, I'm going to let somebody else manage the code. And that's sort of the inversion of control. Somebody else is controlling the life cycle of the bean. So I say greetings equals not new greetings, which you normally would do. You say, hey, Spring, get me that bean that's associated with the greetings class. And Spring says, no problem. You told me on line 10 there that I'm supposed to dole out instances of this greetings class. If you want one, just tell me you want one. And I'm like, yeah, I want one. And I'm like, I'm going to see if you're actually doing your job. I'm going to say greetings dot say hello world. And if this runs, well, things are working well. If Spring isn't doing its job, I'll end up getting a null pointer exception. But I got confidence in Spring. So I'm going to right click, say run as a Java application. This is going to run. And there we go. It prints out hello world. Now there you go. That is your basic Spring framework hello world application. All we did was create a simple Maven project. We added a dependency to Spring context, not Spring core. Spring context, which gives us Spring core and a few other Java jar files as well. And then in our code, we just created a Java bean. We said we wanted this bean to be managed by the Spring container because calling its constructor is just too much work for us. And so we create an instance of the Spring container. That's the application context. We pass the greetings class into the constructor that created that, the annotation config application context class. I can't say that with a straight face. But that tells Spring, manage this class for us. And so when we want an instance, we say, hey, Spring, get me a bean that's a member of the greetings class. It gives us an instance, and then we call on its methods. And it prints out hello world. There you go. That's your Spring hello world. Now, things get more advanced than this, right? There's dependency injection, there is component scanning, and then there's even moving up to Spring Boot. And we will get to that, I promise. But for now, this is a great place to start. Now, by the way, if you enjoy this tutorial, this is just the first in a series, and I've got a whole series on how to do similar things in Spring Boot. So head over to theserverside.com. I'm the editor-in-chief over there. We got lots of great tutorials on Spring Boot, on Scrum, on Agile. If you're interested in me, follow me on Twitter and say hello to me over there. And also, I got a couple books if you're interested. You'll notice behind me, What is WebSphere? That doesn't sell too well. There is Pickering of Springfield, all about how The Simpsons is based on a town in southern Ontario in Canada. Hibernate Made Easy, which the Spring crowd likes. And also there's a book by Darcy DeClue back there, the Scrum Master Certification Guide. If you're working with Agile and doing Scrum and you want to get Scrum Master certified, people are reading that book and scoring 100%. And so there you go. The last thing I would say is if you're watching this on YouTube, why don't you subscribe on YouTube?